faces this morning. And so I'm going to ask if you will look to your left, look to your right, and tell somebody, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. While those persons are coming in and taking their seats expeditiously, we are going to begin this Bayard Rustin crown form with an African libation. A libation honors the sacrifices of individuals upon whose shoulders we stand. And so this crown form, we will dedicate the names of those queer, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, bisexual, and trans individuals. I will pour after the calling of each name, and you, the audience, will say the words, Ashe. And if there are persons in your life, queer, trans, or otherwise, that you would like to lift their names in this space, to welcome them into this space as we open our crown forum. I'll begin. Roderick Ferguson. Vincent Woodward. Bayard Taylor Rustin. Polly Murray. Brazil Johnson. Barbara Jordan. George Washington Carver. Exis Hemphill. James Baldwin. Bell Hooks. Rudolph P. Byrd. Joseph Bean. Marsha P. Johnson. Regina Allen. Are there names that you would like to lift in this space? If so, yell their names out. Ashe. Ashe. Are there other names? Ashe. 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 Oh. Now, this is Crown Forum, and so we will not talk during Crown Forum. It is very disrespectful. So we will give our undivided attention. Welcome to the Bayard Rustin Crown Forum. Now we will have, is Jessica here? Come. Following Jessica, we will have the statement of occasion by George Anthony Pratt, followed by a video clip of the voice of Bayard Rustin.
Hey everybody, how y'all doing today? I go to Clark, and I'm just really special to be here. I left my convocation to come to y'all Crown Forum, and it's good to be in the house with my Morehouse brothers today. Thank you. We all work together to make this legacy And the poem that I'm sharing with you today is a poem that I shared yesterday at the Black Queer Expose. And I really hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you. If you know this nursery rhyme, please join in. Jessica and Dee, sitting in a tree. Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby carriage. Except the D was for Deja. And at my youth, those quick kisses we shared, we vowed to never let it leave the grounds of the playground, because two girls kissing, falling in love, getting married, and having a baby was not a reality back then, but an agenda to poison our youth and to let the devil in. And I knew when I went to church on Sunday, I would have to repent for my sin, baptizing those thoughts and feelings of her, placing them in the deepest parts of my mind, because it was all about presentation. It's just the way of creation, as the preacher reminds us before he closes his sermon. And discernment was the first seed that sprouted in me. And what blossomed curiosity felt like heaven, but it was implied that these same moments would send me to hell, and that what I felt didn't align with everyone else's version of myself. And so I made a choice to make the newfound pieces of me a sacrifice, so that my sins wouldn't condemn me of Daddy's love. My confusion didn't make me stand out. My unpleasant thoughts wouldn't bring shame upon my family and make God disappointed. I took the gate out so no one else would have to, because at 7, I just wanted to be a child, not an abomination. But when I peeked into preteens, the second seed that was sprouting to me would be temptation. And maundering in middle school started conversation, and my body began to speak to me. All those pieces I sacrificed all came rushing back. Puberty about pondering possibilities, and fighting my flesh was my weakness. Hiding what I thought were the ugliest parts of myself became my little secret, and I shared it with girls like Deja. Our kisses went from trees to bathroom stalls, and we kept them confidential and classified, because we knew what happened if we were ever caught in that action. We would be disciplined, and our parents would have our asses. And I never understood what fortified that reaction, but I did understand threats. And my father promised to slap me if he ever caught me in the act. And I didn't second guess his judgment, as I witnessed my friends being punished for their sexual preference and promiscuity, how their parents said it was unladylike to be that way, told me stories about how hands were laid on them and they were preyed on and beaten until the gay went away. And in that moment, I knew our choices really brought shame, and sexuality really meant survival. And the third seed that would grow in me was denial, and I would spiral into a state of illusion. Came to the conclusion that gay shit I had no business doing. A man in good grades is the only thing that I should be pursuing, in addition to wearing dresses and curtsy lessons. I found myself at an intersection of exceeding in Black excellence or worrying the rest of my life about acceptance. Not that it would matter, because the denominating factor was that I was a Black girl who would become a Black woman, and adding lesbian would only diminish my value, because Black women weren't lesbians. We were caretakers and homemakers, and lesbian was just a category in your father's porn collection. My environment reassured me that these feelings were a phase that was a stepping stone into puberty, a phase that was only meant to satisfy the sexual gratification of men, a phase that was for hypersexual freak girls with daddy issues, a phase that was sinister and would eventually wither as I became a woman. And so I waited for this phase to pass by, but it never passed, and it merely cowered. And now I'm 16 in the midnight hour, and the YouTube search engine reads, 2 girls kissing. Wondering, will I ever get to publicly share that feeling? I've cut down so many trees just to make closets and deposit with wardrobes made of false knowledge, and I wore them well. But how long could I fit this version of myself that I had created and hated and mutated and wanted so bad to go away? And the first seed that wanted to grow in me so desperately was to be brave, but it wouldn't sprout until I weeded all the other seeds out and came to the conclusion that my sexuality wasn't a big deal, and the only ones who were tripping were the motherfuckers who couldn't cop a feel. Who couldn't cop a feel and felt entitled to my identity, and what went into me was at the top of their to-do list. They think I'm clueless. I just got to the surface of the soil in the process of uprooting, realizing we all just stupid, Black conditioned Christians in a colonized system that's taught us how to think. They say that all boys love blue and all girls must love pink, and most people don't even know what a social construct even means. And that immense ignorance we place on the shoulders of our Black queer children, and we kick them out, and then wondering why their seeds don't sprout. And when you sow in so much hate, no one tells you how much digging you have to do to uplift and replace and constantly validate that there's enough room for me and my sexuality to cohabitate. My bravery is blossoming beautifully, and saying it out loud makes my inner child feel better. makes my gay feel a lot more realer, makes my rainbow shine a bit brighter, and let girls like Deja know that it's hope, that we are the pot that's at the end of the rainbow, and that every piece of us is gold, and that shame is just a child's game taught by cowards who never got to grow. So go, flourish and flirt and be fluid and sapphic and sassy and do whatever makes you happy, because gay is not an agenda or abnormality. Being gay is just a piece of who you are that makes up your individuality. Thank you, Morehouse.
Good day, Morehouse. This morning, we are assembled in the Crown Nave for today's Crown Forum, named for one of the most important activists and organizers of the 20th century. Bayard Taylor Rustin was the chief architect of the 1963 March on Washington and an influential guide to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the chapel's namesake and college's most esteemed alumnus. Rustin was a conscientious objector, nonviolent agitator, and an international peace advocate who was an openly gay man. President Barack Obama, when posthumously awarding Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, remarked, "For decades, this great leader, often at Dr. King's side, was denied his rightful place in history because he was openly gay." Throughout Rustin's life, his sexual identity served as a site of struggle and tension. In 1953, after delivering a speech in Pasadena, California, he was arrested for lewd vagrancy. In 1960, when preparing for a march in Los Angeles at the Democratic National Convention, Representative Adam Clayton Powell threatened to lie to the press that Rustin and King were gay lovers if King continued to organize with him. When considering Bayard's life, we are called to ponder the Black queer experience. Bayard, like other ancestors and many of us, was a dandy of the field who sported coats of many colors, who dreamed new worlds into being, a gatekeeper that danced betwixt and between dimensions, one of the righteous among us who continued to trek toward the River Jordan. This morning, Bayard invites us to a thin place, a space in time where we find voice messages from the past, present, and future, where we live and love with women, men, ungendered, unnamed, androgynous, and anonymous people, and where we find our creative communicative capabilities akin to Carver, luxuriate in liberating letter writing like Locke, compose couplets comparable to County, lift up lofty lyricisms like Langston, and magically weave metaphors into word magic as McKay. I hear Bayard's voice penetrating from other realms, saying to us that the Black queer experience is a hermeneutic, a method to read and interpret reality as text, to engage in confrontation, and to decode and decipher as orientations to method. Black queerness, or queerness, defies Western limits of reality, of knowing and being, and uncovers what Audre Lorde reveals, the erotic as power, or the erotic as an episteme, a way to become and to know the self, in which body and desire serve as ways of knowing, to understand gender, sexual, and racial identities. To queer, or to queer, is to engage in decolonial deconstruction and make room for imaginative possibilities, to dissect and analyze the normalizing technologies behind the creation and maintenance of race, class, sex, and gender divisions through purposeful attention to cultural performance, social practice, language, and kinship organization. Queering challenges the location and movement of internalized power and power within our communities, and thereby invites us to subvert those power schemes that systematically disenfranchise minoritized bodies and subjectivities. Queering permits us performative regenderings of the body or bodies in ritual contexts, in which scholar Roberto Strongman describes transcorporeality as the modular aspect of the self that allows the ritual and everyday flourishing of non-heteronormative performance and identification. Finally, the Black queer experience, both aesthetically and poetically, translates discursive and epistemological meanings grounded in cultural rituals and lived experiences, while disentangling narratives of normativity, developing and attending to more liberative understandings of human experience and subjectivity rooted in communal knowledge. This type of queering aims to make meaning about the lives and experiences of African-descended people and queer folk, highlighting the multiple, intersecting, and nuanced articulations of selfhood and identity. This is what Bayard calls us to contemplate. Thank you.
If you can't get a decent salary for men who are working in the name of God, how the hell are you going to get rid of poverty? All of the country people are telling me, you can't depend on the unions, they're anti-Negro, they won't stand with you. Well, I think the record here shows that in Memphis, this fight is going to be won because the black people of this community and the trade unions stand together, man to man.
We call for a nonviolent uprising with people sitting, standing, being arrested, white and black together. Our power is in our ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn.
Am I supposed to go back to Harlem and tell the people they have to wait until the Vietnam War is over before money can be got? No, I think we have to put up a political fight for it. I do not believe the war in Vietnam is more important than eradicating poverty, and I think history will reveal that.
What I want to know is, with what politician will you agree in November if they don't get off their fannies and do something?
Our speaker this morning is indeed a true friend in whom I am totally excited for the work and the scholarship that he is embarking upon. Professor Ahmad Green Hayes is the Assistant Professor of African and African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School at Harvard University. A religious historian and cultural theorist, he earned his PhD in religion and African American studies from Princeton University, and his research interests include critical Black studies, Black Atlantic religions in the Americas, and race, queerness, and sexuality in the context of African American and Caribbean religious histories. He is currently completing his first book entitled Underworld Work, Black Atlantic Religion Making in Jim Crow New Orleans, which is under advanced contract with the University of Chicago Press in the Class 200 New Studies in Religious series. In 2022, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Collegium of Scholars here at Morehouse College. He has received numerous awards, and his work can be found in the Journal of Africana Religions, the GLQ, and the Journal of African American History, to name a few. After a selection from Pastor Marika Chisholm, gospel recording artist, the next voice that you will hear is that of Professor Greenhays.
Good morning. Can you turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, breakthrough is coming? If you believe that this morning, can we give God praise? You can start back from the top for me. Hallelujah. Thank you. Dear depression, oppression, anxiety and fear, shame and defeat, I cried my last tear. I'll never forget the bondage I was in. It's time to part ways now. All things must come to an end. It's time for me to praise now. My breakthrough is near. One praise away, one praise away. I am one praise away from my breakthrough. I am one praise away, one praise away. Ooh. I am one praise away from my breakthrough. Can you clap with me? I am one praise away. I am one praise away from my breakthrough. I am one praise away. Yeah, yeah. Praise away. Just one. Come on. Breakthrough, say break. Breakthrough is coming, y'all. Breakthrough's on the way. I'm gonna praise him. Hey. And I'm strong. And I'm moving forward. By faith, yeah. Breakthrough is coming. The past behind me. It no longer binds me. By faith, yeah. Breakthrough is coming. I am stronger, and I'm moving forward. By faith, breakthrough is coming. The past behind me, it no longer burns me. By faith, come on, say this. Breakthrough is coming. Breakthrough is coming. Breakthrough's on the way. And eyes haven't seen. And ears haven't heard. I believe it. Breakthrough is coming. Breakthrough is coming. If you believe it this morning, come on, clap your hands. Hey. No matter what it looks like, we believe that breakthrough's on the way this morning. Say breakthrough is coming. I believe it. Breakthrough's on the way. I receive it. Hey. And I am one praise away. One praise away. I am one praise away from my breakthrough. I am one praise away. One praise away. Ooh. from my breakthrough. If you believe it, clap your hands this morning.
Good morning. One praise away from my breakthrough. Feels real churchy in here. I won't go too far in that regard, but one praise away from my breakthrough. Good morning. It is truly an honor to be here at Morehouse College. I'm grateful to the Reverend Quincy Reinhardt for the invitation to share with you, and to the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Carter for all of his work here at Morehouse, and to the student activists, angelic troublemakers, prophetic voices that are here calling us to higher ground. This is sacred work. I'm grateful to share words, in the name and in the spirit of Bayard Rustin, queer civil rights leader, a Quaker, freedom fighter, so often overshadowed by cisgender, heterosexual male clergymen whose charismatic images have been plastered and sealed upon our cultural memories. I wish to speak with you from the pages of my own notebook as a historian and a critical theorist of Black religion and sexuality. I begin this lecture with a snapshot, one that George has already brought into focus, a snapshot that was taken 70 years ago on January 21st, 1953. Rustin, after delivering a talk at the American Association of University Women, was arrested in Pasadena, California for engaging in consensual sex with two white men. Police reports detailed lewd conduct and vagrancy charges. The Los Angeles Times later announced that Bayard, a quote 40-year-old nationally known Negro lecturer, was sentenced to 60 days in county jail. Rustin, who was a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist organization founded by A.J. Musk that was inspired by the Christian mysticism of the Quakers, would later be forced into resigning from both his position as the co-secretary of race relations and from the membership roles of this prominent civil rights organization. As Devon Carbado and Donald Wise note in Time on Two Crosses, the incident brought Rustin a, quote, new understanding of his vulnerability as a gay man, end quote, in which Rustin himself reflected that I now know that for me, sex must be sublimated if I am to live with myself and in this world any longer, end quote. This event would follow Rustin throughout his life as a political activist, and it was a formidable moment in his own conceptualization of himself as a Black, gay, civil rights leader. In 2020, 3 decades after his death in 1987, Rustin was posthumously pardoned by California Governor Gavin Newsom, who also issued a broader clemency initiative aimed at clearing others who faced similar treatment during the 20th century. Newsom stated, quote, in California and across the country, many laws have been used as legal tools of oppression and to stigmatize and punish queer people and communities and warn others what harm could await them for living authentically. He continued, I think those who advocated for Rustin's pardon, and I want to encourage others in similar situations to seek a pardon to right this egregious wrong, end quote. I begin with these two snapshots because they are representative of what so often happens to queer people and those deemed deviant in the annals of African American historiography. Queer people and the deviant are criminalized, shamed, and often forced into obscurity. As inheritors of their contributions to our global society, we are uniquely positioned and called to both recover and pardon them in our contemporary retellings of the past. Because to rightly acknowledge individuals like Rustin and M, as this talk's title suggests, is to also reckon with the reality that so many of our Black religious, political, and social institutions have failed queer people, sent them to prisons and early graves, forced them into closets and undue suffering, or have demanded our perpetual silence and co-signing of our victimization and abuse. Not only do the cultural practices of our institutions so often replicate these violent occurrences, but our contemporary memories reify their centrality. African American religious history, for example, largely privileges cisgender, heterosexual male clergymen and the churches that they led. But if we move away from the dominant Protestant church history model of African American religious experience and examine other religious institutions and orientations as legitimate sites of inquiry, we find folks like Bayard Rustin, a Quaker, beckoning us to take seriously his religious worldview and to see sexuality as a central feature of his Black religious identity. In my own work, I argue that by expanding our lens of analysis and shifting beyond a myopic focus on largely male preachers and their churches, folks like Rustin force us to see new sites and sources as such persons as women mystics, queer people, sex workers, faith healers, and conjurers blare loudly from the home and communal archives of our people, perhaps here at Morehouse College, at our historic Black churches, and in the spaces and places beyond the four walls of the church. In this vein, we might consider those who were Saturday sinners and Sunday saints. Many of them stumbled into the church house after a night of debauchery and unrestrained sensuality, and then they lingered with heavy heads into the vestibule the next morning, in the church but not yet in the sanctuary. The writer Joshua Bennett has asked, quote, "After all, what is the vestibule if not a space for outsiders, for sinners and latecomers too tired from last night's revelry to rise with the saints?" Yet we might also ask the question about those who were sinners, latecomers, and saints all at the same time, who, like blueswoman Suge Avery and Alice Walker's The Color Purple, envisioned themselves heeding the words of Jesus, "Whosoever will, let them come," busting the church doors open and singing their own tune to their God. And so they came with the smell of last night on their breath and the haze of vice deep in the fabric of their clothes. The songs of Zion enlivened them. In fact, many of them would surely move on up from the vestibule to the choir stand, or from the vestibule to the pulpit, singing songs, chanting their sermons, and pleading for their own soul salvation. Some of them, like Rustin, would lecture and speak the gospel of racial justice in one moment, and then proceed to alternate spaces for queer delight. This, too, is African American religious history. But how exactly do we do this work? How exactly do we recover and pardon those who are intentionally invisibilized in our cultural memory and in our sanitized narratives which foreground Black Christian social respectability as a solve and a balm in this anti-Black Gilead? In his essay, Black Queer Rhizomatics, the Black queer scholar Jafari Allen raises the question, what are the conditions of possibility for beautiful and transformative Black queer work today? Where should we look for inspiration? To whom are we accountable? How should those of us located in academe respond and push the project forward? Allen's queries are provocative for many reasons, but I'll just focus in on two. The first is that many Black queer persons and scholars are at a crossroads intellectually and personally due to incessant enactments of anti-Blackness and queer antagonistic violence in the institutions to which we belong. Second, Allen's questions appear in an anthology that does not include a reading of Black queer religious experiences in the Americas and across the diaspora. While some scholars and the public more broadly often thinks of religion as being a category or lived practice that only excludes queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming persons due to homophobia and transphobia, we should think about how queer persons have engaged with religious traditions on our own terms historically and in contemporary contexts. For example, religious studies scholar Melissa Wilcox makes the provocative argument that religion and the sacred are already transed, that it is religious studies that needs to catch up and be transed. In my own research and teaching, I consistently raise questions about how we have historically and historiographically rendered queer people and trans people as being devoid of religion. I argue that historical scholarship on queer and non-normative sexuality in Black religion can serve as a corrective to this intentional erasure and offer insight into queer past experiences, political organizing, and understandings of the sacred. Indeed, queering is an intentional practice of rendering queer people visible. It is also an acknowledgement that queer people have lived and are living. It says amen to how queer archives, even the surveilled pages of law enforcement and the carceral state, are evidentiary traces of queer desire and life. In this way, queering means returning to the canon of African American history to locate and take seriously the religious lives and experiences of those deemed irreligious or non-religious, which frequently means those who may or may not have identified with a non-normative sexuality while they were alive. To do this work, to do this project, means that historians must think about religion, the history of religion and the history of sexuality, as two co-constitutive elements of American history. We must also think about the blurring, the convergence, and the interdependence between the sacred and the secular, the church and the nightclub, or the spirituals and the blues, as the Black theologian James Howell Cone long admonished, in order to locate African American religious transcendence of sexual conformity and gender constructs of normativity. In the early years of Rustin's life, there was immense historical change in African American communities, but also across the nation due to such events as the Great Migration, the First and Second World Wars, urbanization, the Harlem Renaissance, and the early beginnings of the long civil rights movement. It was also a moment in which shifting understandings of sexuality and Black religion began to materialize. Historians Gillian Frank, Bethany Morton, and Heather White contend that racialization, the evolution of science and technology, and state formation shaped a, quote, modern technology of race, gender, sexuality, and religion, in which conceptions of true religion and good sex connected to broader preoccupations about the social order, what counted as true religion, that is, practices and beliefs believed to be spiritually authentic and socially beneficial, largely that of the Christian church, was that which also supported and encouraged good sex or forms of erotic expression and kinship structures that were socially valued, end quote. Such racialized, gendered, and sexualized policing was most certainly connected to religion, in which many Black religious actors concealed their non-normative sexualities and gender identities, which takes a very intentional practice of trying to find them even when they may not have wanted us to find them. Take, for example, the Reverend Clarence Cobbs and Dr. Mary Evans in Chicago, who the historian Wallace Best describes as being rumored to be gay and lesbian during the Great Migration era. Best also takes up Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes' evasiveness about his sexuality. Similarly, although the blues, rhythm, and gospel singer Little Richard has disowned his identity as a homosexual before his passing, biographer Charles White writes about the singers being gay in the mid-century, despite having grown up in the sanctified church. Richard said, "The gay thing was becoming a big thing in my hometown. I was with gay people a lot because I'd fallen into their bag. You know, I used to tell my mother about the gay scene, and she used to tell me to hush," end quote. Gail Wald likewise writes about Sister Rosetta Tharpe and the rumor of her bisexuality. Wald observes that many black churches of the day, not only Pentecostal denominations, they found ways to look in the other direction when a member transgressed, as long as the transgressor repented or at least kept her sins out of public sight. Given this social context, the scandal of Rustin's arrest, which opened this talk, fell into the company of a larger culture of anti-queer stigma in the church and in the broader American society. But before there was Rustin's arrest, there was the ridicule and sanitization of our collective remembrances of the scientist and religious practitioner who we actually called into the space during the libation, George Washington Carver, Tuskegee's professor of agricultural science, who was known as Man of God, God's ebony scientist, the Negro wizard of chemistry, and root doctor whom black Southerners sought for alternative and plant medicine. As literary historian and queer theorist Marlon Ross contends, quote, "Whatever the etiology, whether attributable to physiology or upbringing, from a very young age, Carver's speech, manner, posture, pose, gesture, and gait all bespeak the sissy boy as vestibule to potential homosexuality, if not a case of transpersonhood, undetectable in a period before such an identity had achieved public recognition," end quote. Carver was known to embrace cross-dressing and drag in the late 19th century, and he had a feminine gender performance, a high-pitched voice, though some attribute that to a medical condition, and he lived most of his life as a bachelor, single, unwed, and without children, all markers of successful heterosexual manhood during the era of Jim Crow modernity. In addition, on Tuskegee's campus, Carver was deemed queer or strange because of his embrace of Africana esotericism, as he would often roam over the fields and the woods in the community with the purpose of making a study of different kinds of soils and various plants. He usually took along his botany case to gather specimens which he carried back to make of study in his laboratory. Despite these characterizations, on October 7th, 1906, Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee's founder, preached about the kingdom of God at their chapel service as being within each and every person at Tuskegee, and cited Carver in his sermon as an example of this beauty. Washington observed, quote, "If you will get into the habit of going into the forest about you once in a while, or rather the woods, as you have no forest about you, you will see for yourself some of the beauty of nature. And that reminds me, I never see Mr. Carver with a bunch of sticks, weeds, or branches, but that I remember that we have one man here on the grounds of Tuskegee who sees all that is beautiful in the things about us," end quote. Ross reminds us that whatever sissy secrets Carver harbored within the relative privacy of the campus, they were kept safe, ironically, by Washington's more public performance of sissy character and conduct aimed at negotiating Jim Crow's relentless violence against any Negro man who dared to conduct himself with the least hint upfront virile masculinity, end quote. Even as Washington was a self-identified heterosexual man, to be very clear, much like Rustin's contemporaries, such as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, and many others, Ross maintains that Washington's performance of black sexual Victorianism functioned as an attempt to clean himself of the, quote, male gender humiliation inherent to the slave status he held up until the age of 9, thus confirming that despite his best attempts, he would never be considered a man in Jim Crow society, despite social reformers' best efforts at reclaiming black manhood. Indeed, who owns black gender and who owns black sexuality? Carver's gender performance and perhaps the unapologetic nature of his gender performance at Tuskegee served as counter to Washington's more public embrace of largely white middle-class markers of masculinity. Moreover, Carver's growing prominence in the Black South as a root doctor and scientist served him and Tuskegee well in that it aided Washington's recruitment efforts. In her 1952 biography of Carver, writer Florence Cornell Means captured the scientist's renowned healing powers, writing, quote, "The colored people soon came to know him. Puzzlingly different from anyone they had met before, they found him able to help them when they tramped to the Institute to tell them their troubles. These Alabama farmers thought him a root doctor, like their own, who treated with charms and potions, as well as herbs and roots. Even when he cured them, some still puzzled about him," end quote. This puzzling as a central feature is precisely where I enter the contemporary discourse on queering black religion, in that queer people like Rustin and them have never been invisibilized insofar as they have already been right here, right there, in everything, everywhere, all at once. As Ross brilliantly reminds us, once we begin to look for them, we quite literally see them everywhere. Perhaps then, so many of us see queer people and choose to look away, or worse, our cultural practices and institutional privileging of certain people and certain bodies require that queer people disavow queerness for our institutional comfort. To, in the parlance of so many Christian churches, cast the sissy out. In the canon of African American literature, James Baldwin's 1953 novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, is perhaps the most prescient example of this conundrum, as a queered Christ is in fraught communion with a queer Baldwin. The novel appears to be a semi-autobiographical fiction, though Baldwin never admitted to such. In part 3, The Threshing Floor, the church infringes on the queer imaginings of a black church boy whose reality is not aligned with the black hypermasculine preacher in the context of the black church. Some good things dwell in John's, the protagonist's black queer flesh, despite how the church deemed his body a vestibule of sin. He is curious about non-normativity, even while in the sanctuary of the temple of the fire baptized. And yet John's stepfather, his own flesh and blood, so to speak, states, quote, "I'm going to beat sin out of him. I'm going to beat it out." Baldwin writes, quote, "All the darkness rocked and wailed as his father's feet came closer, feet whose treads resounded like God's in the Garden of Eden, searching the covered Adam and Eve. Then his father stood just above him looking down. Then John knew that a curse was renewed from moment to moment, from father to son," end quote. John's inner wrestling with queerness, a darkness that rocked and wailed, incited violence and illumined a power imbalance, whereby Gabriel, this godlike figure or overseer, imbued with authority from his faithful congregants, stood above John, the young queer church boy, while looking down upon him. Indeed, in what ways have our prized institutions attempted to exorcise queer and trans people, standing above their souls like plantation overseers? And how much more efficient, more free, more farther along might we be as a people if our institutions had not thrown away, discarded, and abandoned the Baldwins among us? If, as the Reverend Raquel Gill once put it, what are we to do with all these stones that our prized patriarchs rejected? What can we build in the midst of these institutional ruins? Rustin was the stone that the builders rejected and became the chief cornerstone of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But his rejection turned elevation to cornerstone, in my view, is no triumphant story. In fact, I argue that it reveals a larger sadistic paradigm in black political life and culture in which queer and trans people, women and gender nonconforming people are the strategists and architects for our movements and political visions, and are used in the service of what they can do for us, rather than celebrated for the totality of who they are and what they might mean to us. These cultural practices and their normativity amidst Black clergymen and their allies, who often follow right behind them, had grave consequences, and they most assuredly played their part in the political organizing of folks like Marsha P. Johnson, a discarded member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in New Jersey and a practitioner of Santeria, and also in the life of Bayard Rustin. It is worth noting, for clarity's sake, that if our institutions and movements for Black liberation are not havens for all Black people, say in the spirit of the slave hush harbor, then they are nothing short of master-class churches in drag propagating anti-Black religious performances, counter to slave hieroglyphics that ultimately recapitulate the master-class body-soul dismemberment that was so central to shaping the New World. In this way, so many of our institutions function as continuations of the plantation's unethical imperatives, policing Black sexuality and forcing folks into closets. And in closing, I want to turn to some words from Rustin himself from 1986 in an interview with Joseph Beam, in which Beam, a Black gay writer and activist, raised this question to Rustin. He said, in 1958, after having worked closely with Dr. King for some time, how did it feel when he failed to offer you the directorship of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization whose structure was principally drafted by you? Rustin replied, to say I was not disappointed would be a lie. To say I was in any way disturbed other than somewhat disappointed would be untrue. Back then is not now. There was not a gay liberation movement. There was tremendous prejudice to gays, and I think Dr. King had every right to raise questions as to whether prejudice to gays would affect what he looked upon as a very important movement at the moment. I think the likelihood is, had he made me the executive director, it would have created some problems for him, so he declined. But let me say in Dr. King's defense that a few years later, when the question emerged in '63, he stood behind me 100% and acknowledged my right to continue organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I think that was in part because times were changing, but also because Dr. King felt unhappy with what he had to do earlier, end quote. In another separate interview in 1987, the year of his death, Rustin noted, quote, my being gay was not a problem for Dr. King, but was a problem for the movement, end quote. Beam, who had interviewed Rustin a year prior, reflected in one of his own writings published during the AIDS epidemic, quote, when I speak of home, I mean not only the familial constellation from which I grew, but the entire Black community, the Black press, the Black church, Black academia, the Black literati, and the Black left. Where is my reflection? I am most often rendered invisible, perceived as a threat to the family, or am tolerated if I am silent and inconspicuous. I cannot go home as I am, and that hurts me deeply. He later asks, aren't all hearts and fists and minds needed in this struggle, or will this faggot be tossed into the fire? End quote. How often have the queer architects of our religious and racial organizations been charged with being gracious to those who call for their silence and force them into obscurity? How many have died due to societal neglect, only for us to further demonize them on their way into caskets long buried and forgotten in the graveyard and the groin of our experience, as the poet June Jordan put it. Such a query is a beckoning call to us all to take seriously the ways we must remember, recover, and pardon Black, queer, and transgender people in our remembrances of the past. Rustin indeed may very well be one of the civil rights movement's saints. How will we honor him? How will we venerate these queer ancestors? That is our work. Thank you.
Let us again thank Dr. Ahmaud Green Hayes for that lecture. He will join us at 5:30 p.m. in the Chapel Library for our Thurman Thursday conversation. Let us all stand and prepare to sing our college hymn.